The Cold War fueled the push for major advancement in military hardware, and this gear was created simply out of terror and the major concern for defense on both sides. Today, we look at a submarine that was spawned out of Soviet Russia from the Cold War, and as a matter of fact, is still floating around the world today. We talk about the Russian submarine that has more nuclear warheads than any other craft on the planet and can strike from practically anywhere. Today, we talk about Russia's Akula-class submarine. We are looking at the biggest submarine. This particular class is known as the Akula-class to the Russians, and the NATO designation is what they call the Typhoon class. For those who don't know, the reason why I have to clear this up is because there is also a NATO-designated Russian submarine that is also known as the Akula, in which the Russians have designated Project 971 or the Shuka-B submarine, but the Typhoon is designated Project 941. So this is Project 941 that we're talking about. Phew, got that out of the way. Hope you guys aren't that confused. We're talking about one big sub, not the little tiny one. And to get started into this whole video, why do they call it the Akula class? Well, because that is Russian for shark. And definitely when it comes to this submarine, it was definitely a predator and was better than anything America had at the time. Maybe the Americans had things that were more accurate or more silent subs, but this one had the most amount of nukes. As a matter of fact, the Akula-class submarine was so advanced that at the time of its release, the Americans were like, what? The Russians could actually make something like this? When this submarine came around, most of the Americans were like, wow, they were 10 years ahead of where we thought they actually were. And to give you an idea of how this ship all works and why it's so deadly, let's take a little look at its history. So this nuclear-powered ballistic missile began construction in 1976. At the time, Russia had a very good knowledge that the Americans had, or at least were building, the Ohio-class submarine. And the Ohio-class was large. As a matter of fact, it's the competitor to the Akula-class sub. And as a matter of fact, both of these submarines are still, in fact, the largest submarine classes that have ever been built. And to give you an idea of the differences between the two in terms of size, the Ohio class came in at 560 feet long, whereas the Typhoon, or the Akula, was 574 feet long. But of course, it wasn't just the size of the submarine, it was also what it was capable of, and that was firepower. On the American side, you had the Ohio-class submarine that was capable of firing 192 nuclear warheads in one salvo. These also had a firepower of approximately 100 kilotons. Some of you may be out there going, what the heck is a kiloton? How do I measure that? Well, to give you an idea, the Hiroshima bomb, that was 15 kilotons. So these are a lot bigger. They could destroy a city completely. However, of course, the Russians wanted to do bigger and better and longer, and therefore they created the R-39 SLBM, which stands for Submarine Launched Ballistic Missile. Now, before I get into the specifics of this missile, which was made for the Typhoon class submarine, I should probably mention that this submarine came into service in 1981. And as I stated prior, it's still in use today. They just stopped making them in 1989. In total, they had about 7 of these ships planned, with only 6 of them being made. 2 of them are now currently laid up, 1 is still floating, and 3 of them have been retired. As well, interesting enough, when they built these crafts, they were either sponsored by a city or a company to make them. But let's jump back to the R-39 missile, because this was a very important missile that made the Typhoon extraordinarily dangerous. The R-39 missile was introduced in 1983, and it stayed in service until approximately 2004. Now, these missiles had an effective range of 8,300 kilometers. In case you're wondering, if you were to go into the middle of America and the middle of Russia, that's 8,800 kilometers long. So therefore, these ships were capable of firing to American shores while being deep within Russian waters. Now, to give these missiles the extra range, they actually had to be modified, and they were considered one of the heaviest SLBMs in the world, coming in with a total weight of 84 tons. And why were these missiles and the Typhoon class so extraordinarily dangerous? The reason for this is because within one of these missiles, they were armed with 10 nuclear warheads, with each one being approximately 100 to 200 kilotons. And that was just within one warhead, because within the Typhoon or Akula class submarine, they had 20 of these missiles ready to go and fire.
Let's talk about the Russian space program because it's really fascinating and you guys might be surprised at what they've accomplished. Before the Russian space program, known to many in the past as the USSR, Soviet Space Program, but today has evolved to become the Russian Federal Space Agency, or RFSA. Now you could say that the two programs are almost separate from each other because the RFSA began on February 25th, 1992, and as for the Soviet program, it started all the way back in the 30s. But before we can really get into some cool facts about the Soviet space program, we need to understand where it all came from. We need to learn about its origins. Back in the 1800s, because of scientists such as Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who inspired the Russian Empire to look into space as an academic, he helped evolve a group of scientists to create a group called the GIRD on September 15th, 1931. Now it stood for the Group for Study of Reactive Motion, and these group of guys created the world's first rocket program, eventually creating the GIRD-9, which was the first liquid-fueled rocket and the first hybrid rocket being the GIRD-X, created on November 25th, 1933. But unfortunately at this time it was still quite a ways before it became a space program. During the Second World War, the Russians had captured scientists and plans for the V-2 rocket program that was created by the Germans, which eventually led to the creation of the world's first and Russia's first intercontinental ballistic missile. And it was called the R-Semyorka, which was built in 1957. Now, unlike NASA, the Soviet space program was heavily fused with the Russian military. And although Sergei Kirillov, who was the father of the Russian atomic bomb, was working under the military, he kept his goals of space exploration secret from them. And the rocket and space program was second in military spending because the military needed ICMs. And even though the idea of space exploration was pretty much laughable at the time, they did indeed release Sputnik 1, which was the first satellite to ever leave the Earth, putting it into a low orbit on October 4th of 1957. Although Sputnik 1 was the first satellite ever, it didn't have any sensory equipment. But however, because they tracked and studied Sputnik, it gave scientists ideas of how the upper atmosphere and orbit works. And although the Soviet space program was behind the United States, who put a monkey into orbit by 1948, they were the first country to put a dog in space, and more importantly, it was the first animal to ever orbit the planet. The dog's name was Laika, and she was a stray dog found on the streets of Moscow, and she was launched into space in Sputnik 2 on November 3rd, 1957. However, unfortunately, Laika died in the spacecraft due to overheating because of equipment failure. And for some, many viewed Sputnik as the future of space exploration, but for some, it screamed fear. The Sputnik program had become good propaganda to fuel the Cold War, which in turn fueled the space race. This era was known as the Sputnik crisis, and America had become quite fearful of Russia's new achievements, and therefore because of Russia, that is why NASA was created. Now if you were to compare NASA to the Russia program, you'd probably say NASA's bigger and better because they landed people on the moon. But before they landed anybody on the moon, Russia had achieved much more. First of all, they were the first program to ever put a man and a woman into space. The first astronaut or cosmonaut to ever go into space was Yuri Gagarin, who flew way past the atmosphere on April 12, 1961 in the Vostok 1 space capsule. He was also put into an orbit at 161 kilometers above sea level and flew around the Earth in orbit for 108 minutes. And what I find really crazy about that is because Yuri was only 27 years old, which most people will credit Sally Ride as the youngest astronaut, but if you want to be technical, Sally was 33, and I mean Yuri, yeah, he was like 27. But to top both of them, Gurman Titov was a 25-year-old cosmonaut when he went up into space in Vostok 2. He was also the second person to orbit the planet and was the fourth person in space because the Americans had sent up two people in between Vostok 1 and Vostok 2.
The question that so many people are asking is, why is Russia invading Ukraine in the first place? Well, the history behind this traces back to the dissolution of the Soviet Union and Russia's path to reclaim a place on the global scale, as well as Ukraine's fight to protect its sovereignty. For a century, the Russian Empire and the Habsburg Empire were in control of all of the territory that makes up present-day Ukraine. And then, many years later, Ukraine became a cornerstone of the Soviet Union, which by the end of the Union consisted of 15 Soviet Socialist republics. Now, the factor number 9 has to do with the end of the Soviet Union. Well, when it comes to the formation back in the year 1922, Ukraine and Russia were two of the founding members of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as the USSR, or commonly just referred to as the Soviet Union. Now, ironically, Russia and Ukraine were also the signatories of the treaty that terminated the Union in December of 1991, and that was when Ukraine voted for independence in a democratic referendum. The end of the Union also ended the ban on the Ukrainian language. So this seemed like it was a step forward for Ukraine, but not necessarily. Either way, let's move on to fact number 8, the formation of NATO. Following World War II, the United States as well as Western European forces, they formed what is known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO for short, which is an intergovernmental military alliance that was first created to block the Soviet Union's growing influence. Now let's look at Article 5. NATO members, they agreed to Article 5 of the treaty. And this article states that an attack on any NATO member is considered an attack on all members. Yeah. So this, of course, was more than enough to deter the Soviet Union from ever invading countries who had joined NATO. Number 6 takes us to the expansion of NATO. Starting in the year 1999, about 8 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO began to expand. And by the year 2004, NATO added the former Soviet Baltic republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And then 4 years later, NATO declared that it had the intention to offer membership to Ukraine someday in the distant future. And that, of course, crossed a red line for Russia. And by the year 2020, NATO had added an additional 14 members, and many of those were once Soviet-controlled countries. Russia sees NATO as a big threat. Vladimir Putin, who is the president of Russia, he's voiced his opinion loud and clear many times that he sees that NATO's expansion is an existential threat. And the idea of having Ukraine join NATO, well, that, in his words, is a hostile act. He was even reported saying that Ukraine's aspiration to join the military alliance was a dreadful threat to Russia. This brings us to number 4. Russia sees Ukraine as part of Russia. In the past, Vladimir Putin has emphasized his view that Ukraine is a part of Russia, culturally, linguistically, as well as politically. Now, there are some people, mostly Russian-speaking people in Ukraine's east, they feel the same as the president, but more Ukrainian-speaking population in the West, they have generally been more in favor of individuality and greater integration with the rest of Europe. So on that issue, Ukraine being part of Russia, you're going to get a whole lot of different mixed answers depending on who you ask. That brings us now to number 3, the annexation of Crimea. Relations were further made a lot more complicated between Russia and Ukraine after Russia annexed Crimea. And Crimea is a strategic military and shipping base of the Black Sea, and this happened back in the year 2014. It was a major event. It was all over the news. Either way, in February and March of 2014, Russia invaded and subsequently annexed the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine, and this took place in the aftermath of what is known as the Revolution of Dignity. The Crimean Peninsula has been historically tied to Russia, but it had been integrated into Ukraine and was a major economic asset to them after the fall of the Soviet Union. The next fact, NATO reiterates their intentions. And by the way, NATO does not recognize Russia's sovereignty over Crimea. But moving on though, at a 2021 NATO conference, the member nations reiterated that they had intentions to acquire Ukraine. And this triggered the most recent Russian military aggression that has accumulated in this invasion in 2022. Now we end this episode off with number 1, what Russia wants with Ukraine. Well, the biggest reason for the invasion is for Russia to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. NATO's land border with Russia would significantly increase if Ukraine had joined them. Also, Russia established a naval base in Crimea after annexation, and if Ukraine were to join NATO, well, this would give Ukraine significantly more resources to potentially take back the peninsula.